I was talking to a Politico in Olympia today, and they said that they were looking forward to, over the break, playing Claire Obscure Expedition 33. Have you played that?
It's my life right now.
Oh, I bet.
It is my life. It is so good. The problem is that I have to be sitting here with you in a podcast studio instead of clackety-clacking on my PlayStation 5 controller.
Wearing your little beret and
Yep.
flying around with your little... This is as much as I know as there's berets involved.
There are mimes that you can find and kill.
It's time for Sound Politics. This is Sound Politics. I'm Scott Greenstone.
And I'm Libby Denkmann. You know, Scott, holidays are that time when a lot of folks, I don't know, I do this at least, I kind of take stock of my personal and professional life, think about the year, kind of sit back and with maybe a hot toddy and really reassess where I'm at.
Okay.
For
Sounds
politicians, it can be a great time to announce a departure from office.
Ooh,
For example, last week we learned Representative Dan Newhouse from right here in Washington State, Central Washington congressman. He's retiring.
Incredible turn from the personal to the political there. Newhouse is the longest serving Republican in Congress in Washington State at the moment, and he told journalists that he was planning to spend about a decade in Congress, and that is more than over. I think he's been in for 11 years. It'll probably be 12 by the time he is done next year. He is planning to serve out his term. There has been a lot of skepticism about his stated reasons for not running for re-election because, President Trump has targeted Newhouse every re-election year since 2021 when, Dan Newhouse voted to impeach Trump.
Yeah, he's one of the last two standing Republicans who voted to impeach Trump after January 6th. I don't want to generalize here, but there have been a record number of congressional departures announced for this early ahead of a midterm election. There's been a lot of speculation that Republicans particularly believe that they are going to get wiped out in these midterms. And they are looking at voter dissatisfaction with President Trump and saying, maybe it's time that we're going to be out of power anyway. It's going to be harder to get anything accomplished if Democrats take the majority. So if I was on the fence about sticking around, now's the time that I would hit the old dusty trail. There's also been a high number of Republican women who have voiced frustration with Mike Johnson's leadership as Speaker while they were heading for the exits. But as you say, very explicitly, Newhouse said, absolutely not. This is not about Trump.
Yeah, that is what he said. I also think, in addition to all that, it doesn't seem like a great time to be in the Republican Party. I'm seeing all of this coverage of the Turning Point USA, convention this last weekend, the first big meeting, or the biggest meeting since Charlie Kirk was assassinated earlier this year. And there's a lot of division bubbling to the top in the Republican Party right now. I mean, in Newhouse's case, also, there's kind of some separate things, some very particular things. He has gotten death threats this year. And I asked his spokesperson if that had anything to do with it. About a month ago, a man from Tukwila pled guilty to threatening to kill Newhouse and his staff members. The congressman did not respond to that question.
Come on the pod, Dan Newhouse. We've tried before. We've asked him on KUOW. I get it. He's in Central Washington. He's a Republican. They are more and more leery of coming on NPR, unfortunately. But
hey, Baumgartner came on.
Yeah, Baumgartner came on, and Dan Newhouse for the pod in 2026 before he goes. That's my goal.
Also, Bob Ferguson for the pod.
By the way,
we still got to get Bob on. Not that Bob is a Republican, obviously. Speaking of departing from office, here in Seattle, a number of elected leaders are currently, as we speak perhaps, packing up their desks, much less voluntarily, right?
This was not their call.
Right, totally, yes.
One Republican and a number of more moderate city council members are heading out, not to mention the mayor.
Right.
They were swept out of office here on that progressive tide that we saw last month.
Right, and we have talked about that a lot. One big headline that we haven't spent a ton of time talking about on this podcast is that city council president, Sara Nelson, is on her way out, lost re-election. And you, Libby, you sat down with her to look back on the year.
Yep.
That is that time of year, and consider what can be learned, and consider, I guess, the year ahead and the times ahead for Seattle.
It was like
politics.
an exit interview. Yeah,
Yeah.
That's what we were doing. That's why we reached out.
Yeah, I think one thing we can definitely learn from Nelson's time leading the council is that her approach seemed pretty unpopular, at least from the standpoint of voters and how many people voted for her.
Yeah, I mean, you could say that after this last re-election, but Nelson argued to me that, she was elected in 2021, and then you saw, her go from being an outlier on the council in 2021 as like one of the only moderates to being at the center of power, because then you saw voters vote in a bunch more moderates in 2023. But, this was a resounding defeat for her in November. She lost by 26 points to Dion Foster, a more progressive type of politician, a nonprofit leader. Nelson was seen as pro-business, more public safety focused. She was, backed by like real estate and business folks,
right.
Versus more union-backed labor folks for Foster. Nelson is the co-founder of Fremont Brewery. Foster criticized Nelson for support of some public safety legislation like the soap and soda laws, those anti-drug and anti-prostitution laws, trying to ban people from certain areas like Aurora Avenue. Foster claimed that those reform efforts are counterproductive. And Nelson's arguments, frankly, to the contrary, didn't seem to land with voters.
Yeah, I think, especially just considering, I think of her time on the council these last 4 years as a very fractious time. She clashed with protesters at City Hall a lot. She backed, those laws you mentioned that proved pretty controversial. Ultimately, I don't think those kind of fronts won her much support. She also spent a lot of time banging this drum of, good governance, talking about spending taxpayers' money better. None of that seemed to resonate with voters this year. Her loss, as you mentioned, was super resounding. And it, I think, signifies an end of an era to some of the pandemic era, the moderate policies that Seattle tried out.
Yeah. So Nelson, again, she comes into office after being elected in 2021.
Right.
This is at the same time that you saw Bruce Harrell come into office, City Attorney Ann Davison. This was still during the pandemic when voters were seeing rising visible homelessness and crime. And Nelson says she saw herself as a change agent. She especially wanted to focus on police hiring and small business issues.
Yeah. I think what she'll be remembered for personally, if I had to say, is just that, like, it doesn't seem like a great time to be in City Hall for a number of different reasons. 2 city council members just straight up left when Sara Nelson was council president these last couple of years. One of them left after she had been on the job only a year and a half. She was, one of those moderates you mentioned that got voted in 2023.
Kathy Moore.
Yeah. And she just kind of was like, I don't want to do this anymore, which really raised my eyebrows. So, Libby, before we started taping, you mentioned something that I thought was really interesting that stood out to you about this interview. You said you wanted to know, in the middle of all this chaos in City Hall, what it's like to be Sara Nelson.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the most controversial figures at City Hall. She clashed with progressives, of course, but she also clashed with some of her natural allies, some of those more moderate folks who came into office in 2023. So, yeah, I wanted to know what it was like to kind of be at the center of that. And I have to say, she was pretty open about all of that. I mean, she talked about her personal bio and why she has, I think, kind of a thicker skin. She also, I will say, took some parting shots at Mayor Bruce Harrell and his administration. Another progressive, like we mentioned, elected at the same time as her. But, I don't think there's a lot of love lost between Harrell and Nelson. She suggested that she didn't believe the mayor moved quickly enough on implementing certain public safety policies and that may have dragged down the moderates overall on the ballot.
That's interesting.
But, I mean, we should say, like, Mayor Harrell lost a very close election to Katie Wilson, a progressive, whereas Sara Nelson really got buried by Dion Foster.
Yeah, I can see the argument of like, look, we passed tougher laws, but the mayor didn't get the police to enforce them. But, you know, I saw a lot of negative press around the time that they were passing those laws, especially the stay out of drug area and the stay out of, you know, prostitution zone or whatever it's called, SOAP. It does, you know, Nelson's loss to me feels like a return to the pre-2020 status quo in Seattle that we had. Progressives, but not radical city council members, right? If she won in 2021 in an election where voters were like, do we pick a moderate, maybe even kind of a conservative in like the city attorney's case, or like sort of a radical who wants to defund the police? That was the choice between Sara Nelson and the other candidate at the time, Nikita Oliver. We're going to pick the more moderate choice.
Yeah.
And now I think it's really just voters being like, you know, let's get back to like what we're kind of used to, which is like more progressive but not radical folks. So
you're arguing kind of that the Nelson, Harrell, and Davison period was a deviation from the norm.
Yeah, I think we learned something maybe about Seattle voters, right? Which is like faced with radicals, they'd rather choose moderates, but faced with progressives or moderates, you know, yeah, I know we're talking about all notches of left of center here.
Welcome to
Everyone
Seattle
here is a
politics,
Democrat,
baby. Yeah.
Except for Ann Davison. But yeah, so anyway, I am interested to hear more from Sara Nelson about, you know, this short period of time when she held back the progressive tide and how she thinks we will remember it.
Yeah, so let's dive into that conversation. We're going to get into this part where I ask basically about whether she felt that voters were dissatisfied with the pace of change. You know, she called herself a change agent, but were voters mad that there wasn't enough change in Seattle over the past 4 years, and therefore she and other incumbents were punished? Do you think that there was an anti-incumbency sentiment that like things had been recovering from the pandemic, we have less visible homelessness, crime is down and coming down, as you say, police staffing up, but that people were not satisfied with how much progress had been made in the past 4 years? Basically, was there an element of dissatisfaction with incumbents like yourself that contributed to this?
Yes. Yes, I will say unequivocally yes. I think that, first of all, the change, when people were calling for change this past campaign, in my mind I was thinking, change from what? From clean, accessible parks, from lower 911 response times. I think we need to not change, but amplify and continue those trends. But what you were you just asked dissatisfaction, and I think that's true. I believe that people, when they saw a small business owner, a Republican city attorney, and Bruce Harrell elected, that demonstrates a level of fed-upness that got us into power, and we had big problems to solve. And I will be the first to say that I am frustrated with the amount of change that we were able to accomplish. And I always have to remind people that council passes the laws and makes the budget, but it's the executive that implements those changes in law. And there is a tension between what I can do as a council member and what the executive is supposed to do, implementing what comes out of council. And I think that I lost some moderate support because they wanted to see things better. In the beginning, I was always getting calls from reporters on the radio saying, this business in Ballard was just burglarized for the 7th time. What do you have to say to that small business owner? And what I would always say was, I relate to their frustration that change has not happened faster. And I do believe that the mayor could have been more used his mandate of 60%. I don't know what he won by, but used the mandate to push more quickly on bringing back on public safety and on really seriously looking at what we were doing on homelessness response and make those changes. And because there are vested
like with shelter or what kinds of things would you say were like the number one shortfall over the last 4 years?
Well, first of all, the mission of the KCRHA failed utterly when it came to, first of all, their first big thing, which was we're going to remove encampments and get people who are in encampments into shelter downtown. $10 million effort failed flatly, right? And so there was always a question of how was the agency's implementation plan matching the reality of the funding that was available. They were supposed to develop a by name list of individuals.
I remember that, yeah.
And that is what every other city has done that has worked well.
The really chronic homelessness cases, people who need high amounts of services that are tying up a lot of response, emergency rooms and police response. This was supposed to be a list that would help target assistance, right?
Right. We need to know the different reasons why people are living in unsheltered homelessness. Other people are living on couches. We don't see them. We have to better understand the individual needs of the people that are living without homes. All right, that's the only way we can really help them, and that never happened. And they will say privacy reasons, you can't let go of health details, but a description of what this person is struggling with and what they need. Some want to go back to family in some other part of the country. We can help that. Other people have gotten off their meds. They need to get back to the clinic. That's another thing. Without that basic knowledge of the struggles of the people that we're dealing with, we can't make a meaningful difference. And when that problem is substance use disorder, we need to put a lot more resources in addiction treatment and making sure that we're assertively encouraging people to access those options. That's been a big part of what I've tried to do. And
you've talked about your recovery journey yourself, and you were piloting a program to get people into recovery services, round the clock types of residential recovery services. For you, that's got to be, obviously a passion project, and also something that is frustrating because there is so much unfinished business when it comes to how do we get the people on the street the support that they need. I mean, what do you think is the answer going forward for the city?
Here's the thing. I think that when your listeners hear that we're providing housing with wraparound services, we need to get people into treatment. They do not realize that, first of all, when I was elected, there was no rehab. I'm talking about the rehab that I went to, the Amy Winehouse style. You go in, you spend a month, you try to get your mind together, and we weren't funding that. Shocking to me. We were only funding methadone and buprenorphine and then harm reduction efforts by our outreach workers to distribute needles. I'm fine with that. Drug consumption supplies, I don't believe that is reducing a particular harm, but really limited services. And so when I saw that, I pushed for getting a pot of money to allow for people to be immediately referred into a treatment facility if they wanted to take that step. We're not talking coercion. If they wanted to take that step, and then that facility would bill the city, that's working. That started at $300,000, and this budget has $2.85 million for those kinds of services. That's a positive change. But it took too long to get there. And so I hope that the city continues working on that. But that is one area. You asked me, what change have you seen? That is a positive change, and we need to center recovery in the conversation about public safety and homelessness, because it's all tied together.
We're going to take a quick break here on Sound Politics. Back in a moment. And we're back with more Sound Politics and my conversation with outgoing Seattle City Council President Sara Nelson. What is broken about city government that stops the wheels of solutions getting passed? What do you think is the biggest thing that slows things down or prevents policies that we know are effective from being? Is it money? Is it bureaucracy? What's What's the problem?
All right, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say
Bring
some
it.
things that are a little bit controversial. Number
You're
one,
on your way out. You can say whatever you want.
it's probably intuitive to a lot of people. It's all of that you said, but the providers that are providing the services right now have a vested interest in the funding flows that are going to their services. And it's very difficult to break out of that. And that is one reason why you need people who are consultants when they're looking so what are we going to do on homelessness and how should we reform KCRHA? They need to keep what is the best policy and what will have our biggest bang for the buck. They should not be considering what's going to play at the ballot box. This is going to piss off this group of people, and so let's not go there. And so that's sort of the entrenched mindset of how policymakers on primarily on the executive side, because they form the levy, the ballot measures, and it's their people that are implementing the plans that are set in place. And it's very hard to say no to the way things are going right now, but it must be done. And I am not afraid of ruffling feathers. When I put forward my pot of money for inpatient treatment, I got a lot of pushback from people that claim that abstinence is paternalistic. That's the wrong way to go. It is one option. It's one path of recovery that people can take. It doesn't have to be the only one, but we have to offer that as an option if they're addicted to meth, and the only thing we're offering is opioid use disorder medication.
So basically, we can't try new things. We can't, evolve our policies if there are entrenched interests that need the same level or growing levels of funding every year. Those paths are well worn, and it's really difficult to change once those have been established, those relationships, those constituencies in the city. Let's kind of pivot here, because you mentioned you ruffle feathers. That has been true throughout at least your time as council president. There was the conversation earlier this year. You and I sat down after Tammy Morales left the council. Another council member also left, although citing more personal reasons, Kathy Moore. Morales had kind of been vocally, she wrote some pieces and did a lot of interviews talking about what she felt was a atmosphere of toxicity on the council, a lack of democratic process. You had come on and you talked to me about, the defending the integrity of the council, basically, disputing her claims. But she's not the only person who you've butted heads with and who have butted heads with you. Even folks who are politically your allies on the council. Bob Kettle, he came out and said he wasn't happy about the way, for example, the SOTO housing bill was passed. This was about 1,000 units of workforce housing near the stadiums. The Port of Seattle had really strongly come out against it. And they were upset about congestion and potentially impacts to the workings of the port down there. What do you have to say to people who think that you were being too sharp-elbowed or that you were throwing your weight around too much as council president in a way that prior council presidents had not?
One could dispute that last point, but here's what I will say. It is absolutely normal for in a legislative body to have differences of policy opinion and to hash that out at the dais. And that's what happened with Bob Kettle and I, and that was completely normal and should be expected and encouraged. Because the voters need to know what we are really thinking, and we say it on TV, right? So that was fine. And I took that on because we are in a housing affordability crisis. Our small businesses can't afford their commercial spaces. It was the only thing that I could do that would really address both those issues. And I had a wide coalition of 22 labor locals, 173,000 union members, in addition to neighborhoods that wanted more public safety, and the affordable housing providers. That was a broad coalition behind what I was doing, and there was not credible evidence that for me not to do it. The EIS said that there would be no negative impacts to the port, and Longshore wouldn't lose jobs. And so, if there was good reasons for me just to not do this, I wouldn't have brought it forward because I knew the heat I would take. But
the Port of Seattle, obviously is a really strong and important center of power in city politics. It also, the opposition, Dan Strauss was part of the opposition. Again, I mentioned Bob Kettle. I mean, you were really taking on a lot when you decided to go after that. Sorry, continue.
Well, I was being pushed by a lot too. Not pushed, encouraged, applauded, and those are the people I was responding to, because those are low income entrepreneurs and residents that we have got to keep in Seattle. And this was workforce housing. The land underneath was zoned to require 50% workforce housing. That was not some promise. That's housing for our teachers and our baristas and retail workers. There is far too little of that. And so that was my North Star. And then I would have to look at the port. That is what they said on the record. I also know that they approved a hotel on the block. That's a lot of traffic. We're talking about additional vehicles from up to 1,000 units. There are 5 million people that visit the stadiums just next door. And so I didn't think that their argument about disruptions to freight traffic were warranted by the science and also by everything else that was going on there. No. The port had told me that they really were looking at those 2 blocks as a place for a tower for an operator of Port 46. So they had their own vested interests that weren't completely transparent during the course of that conversation. Bottom line, yes, I knew that there would be some opposition. I took on interest to do what was best for low income and struggling people in this town, and I stand by it.
Do you agree that you were a different kind of council president in terms of how you pursued your policy goals, how you used the power of the presidency on the council?
Yes, I do agree that is the case, because here's the thing. I am 59 years old. I'm a 59-year-old woman, middle-aged woman in recovery, right? I'm at the end of my career. I'm not looking at what is my next political move. That gives me freedom. That gives me freedom to just to focus on policy priorities that I think that will help the most people in the city of Seattle. I guess that means I'm sort of shameless. I have built up a lot of scar tissue and deep skin. And so it's kind of hard to hurt my feelings as long as I know in my heart and I'm communicating why I'm doing what I'm doing, the values that are motivating my policy initiative. Then people can take that at face value. And if some people don't like it, then I can accept that. I knew this job was going to be hard. Look where Seattle was in 2021, and that had been going on for 9 years. I knew I was going to ruffle feathers when I called for a difference. But it had to happen because the city was at a crossroads, and one of my goals was to change the direction of the city and the kind of leadership that was making that decision. And I worked on the campaigns of the people that were elected in 2023. The pro-public safety candidates were the ones that won because that was the people's top priority. You
saw what your priorities were vindicated by that election, basically, by
yes.
saying the electorate wanted to move more towards your perspective than your opponents. Just really quickly on the workforce.
And it wasn't my perspective. It was my constituents' priorities. Yes, go on.
On the issue of the workforce housing, so at this point, there's a couple different threads of ways that this plan could be stymied to add housing in SoDo near the stadiums. Again, in the face of opposition from the port. The port has challenged it in court. That is a pending piece of litigation. Also last month, there was a state board that ruled that the council had violated environmental laws and growth regulations when it approved that Makers District. So that plan can still be amended and revived to comply with the state board, what they were highlighting. Do you think that this new council will take that on? What do you think? Is that plan dead at this point?
Probably. Why would anybody else put themselves in that position and reignite that fight? But I will tell you, there are appeals pending. We don't know the final outcome of those of the growth management and the case in court. So it's too soon to know what will happen there. But I do hope that this council focuses on the need to produce more workforce housing, and I'm proud of the work that I did to make sure that the strongest possible multifamily tax exemption program was approved, because that is where a lot of our units come from, private developers that set aside those units for workforce level income people, and so there are a lot of ways to get to the end goal. And I haven't mentioned one thing, an initiative that I started late that I really hope will continue, and that is we have to fix our permitting nightmare problems. And because that is slowing economic activity, it's hurting small businesses that want to redo their spaces. It's a major hassle, and it increases the cost of housing because of the length of time it takes to get permitted.
This is one of the big bugaboos of liberal states and cities, frankly. It's one of the things that, Ezra Klein has talked about in the book Abundance.
Yes.
This issue of regulation basically slowing growth to such a degree that then you see housing costs rising, et cetera. Yeah.
Exactly. I am an abundance Democrat. I will say that right now. We have got to align our regulatory environment with our policy goals. And if we have barriers that are keeping us from achieving our goals, remove them. And that is what I was trying to do with permitting, and I hope that work continues, because that will be easier to build, less expensive housing coming online.
Okay, Scott, that is just part of my conversation with outgoing Seattle Council President Sara Nelson. The full hour-long interview is over on the Sound Side feed. We didn't get to a bunch of stuff in this version for Sound Politics, like the legislation that she had passed that seems pretty directly targeted at Christian Sinderman, a consultant for Mayor Bruce Harrell, who Nelson was unhappy with the role that he took at City Hall.
He was sort of a power player in the background, but he then also worked for one of the progressives running for city council.
He worked for Foster at one point, Nelson's opponent.
Okay.
So anyway, we get to all of that in another longer interview, the version that's over on the Soundside feed if you want to go listen to that. But Scott, before we head out for the holidays, I just had one more little piece of this Sara Nelson interview that I wanted to share.
Okay.
And that is, right at the end, she talked about incoming Mayor Katie Wilson.
Oh, okay. I bet she stayed spicy.
No, she didn't. Listen, hear me out. I think that Sara Nelson is Wilson pilled.
Oh my God. A Wilson cell?
She's Wilson cell. Here, take a listen.
I wish the Wilson administration well. My impressions of her on the campaign trail is that she is smart and sincere. You know where she's coming from. And
a fellow policy nerd. I mean,
from one policy nerd to another, right? Yeah, and sometimes I didn't know that with Bruce, with Mayor Harrell. Sometimes when it came to police incentives or the conforming to state law on public use, sometimes I didn't know if he was willing to go there, or if maybe they would be people that would be too upset that it didn't make it worth it. No. Katie Wilson has firm commitments, and she's putting good people around her. Let's give her a chance. Let's give her administration a chance. That's what I would say. And council, we pass the laws and the budget. We are essentially kind of the more, I would say, powerful when we think about long-term change of the city. I hope that that this council can work well with the mayoral administration, because what our voters need to see is both branches of government working well together in a functional way to get things done for the city.
Okay, so leaving on a note of optimism for the new administration, that is Sara Nelson, outgoing Seattle City Council president. But as you heard, she did take one last jab at the outgoing mayor, Bruce Harrell.
So sort of spicy toward the end, although I'm surprised.
Yeah, I mean, hey, she's a moderate, but she has hope that Wilson is going to be a progressive that she can get behind.
I'm surprised, but sound politics, reliable amounts of spice for you, and we're going to continue. What am I?
A little sugar and spice for the end of the year. Just for your Christmas cookies.
I love that. We will be bringing you sugar, spice, and everything nice and everything politics in 2026. Thank you so much for listening with us and to us all this year. That is it for Sound Politics today and for 2025. Kind of crazy.
Whoa.
Our show was produced by Sara Leibovitz and Hans Anderson. Cat Smith is our editor. I'm Scott Greenstone.
And I'm Libby Denkmann. And this show is only possible because of listeners like Catharine. Catharine, Thank you so much for your support for Sound Politics. If you want to join Catharine and other folks who power this public radio podcast, there's a link in our show notes to donate. Thanks, everybody. Happy New Year.
See you next year.